Begin with, can you give us a brief overview of your lab's central focus in neuroeconomics and what core questions about decision making drive your work today?
Well, I mean, I began my study really as a biologist, and I was really fundamentally interested in understanding how it is that the brain makes decisions. And that work, which I began as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania and then brought here as an assistant professor over 30 years ago, was really focused on the idea that by tracing the paths through the brain that make decisions, we'll really come to understand how decisions happen. And while I think we made good headway in tracing out the basic pathways, it became clear really quickly that I really didn't know anything about decision making. What I knew about was neuroscience. And in my first few years here, I really faced that fact as an assistant professor and committed myself to the psychology of judgment and decision making and dragged myself through the bulk of our, now what you would call our graduate curriculum in the psychology of judgment and decision making in the psychology department, which led to me becoming a professor in psychology and really improved the work because I was trying to understand how to combine psychology and neuroscience to understand human decision making. I next got really interested in animal decision making, and one of the reasons was that, as you know, human decision making at least appears to be terribly irrational, and it makes it hard to understand sometimes. And the studies that had been done of animal decision making suggested that animals were much more rational in their decision making. And so trying to understand foraging theory and animal decision making kind of came next. I spent a few years hanging out with the sort of crusty old guys in the American West who had invented modern foraging theory. And they really pushed me and said, if you really want to understand human decision making, you have to understand economics and at a deep level. And so that led me eventually to our economics department, where I'm also now a professor. And it's the effort to combine all these different viewpoints on decision making which characterizes my lab. My notion at the time was simply that you'd do a better job understanding decision making if you used all the tools that are available rather than just looking as a biologist, a psychologist, an economist, or even a foraging theorist. So my lab then really set out to understand the mechanism of decision making. But here, when I say mechanism, I mean not just the mechanism from the point of view of wires in your brain, but also from how an economist would think about mechanism. What are the calculations, computations, and representations in the brain that are guiding our decision making? I'd say that for the first 20 years, the real focus on my lab was understanding the basic mechanism of decision making and really trying to reconcile this puzzle, which is why do humans seem to make such irrational, crazy decisions when animals seem to make such rational and perfect decisions. This just seems an absolute puzzle at first blush. As we laid out the foundations of how the brain represents the values of options we're considering, the mechanisms by which it weighs the relative values of those two options, the mechanism by which it chooses, it became more and more obvious that we were gaining fundamental insights that were important to disease states. And so in the last 10 years, my work has really shifted from being exclusively about the basic neuroscience and economics to being more and more about applying that economics and neuroscience